Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of our Webinar Wednesday series. Today, we'll be talking about locations and establishment-based AAPs and how to go about that. So my name is Yesenia Avila. I'm a consultant with DCI Consulting. I'll be joined by Brittany Dean, also a consultant, and we'll be going through the presentation. Just a reminder that the phone lines are muted, and you're welcome to send questions to questions@dciconsult.com. If you have any technical difficulties during the call, please email the same email address. Q&A session will be held at the end of the presentation as needed. Just a disclaimer that we are not lawyers, we are consultants. We work with plenty of lawyers, but we are not here to advise you on legal matters. Make sure that if you have specific questions for the AAP structure or your establishment base, that you consult with your AAP consultant and counsel. These materials are copyrighted and may not be reproduced, copied, or used without prior permission from the authors. Again, please feel free to send questions to questions@dciconsult.com. So our statement here, we've included the DCI mission statement and our vision statement. Again, we're a consulting firm and we focus on HR compliance, data analytics, and litigation support. A little bit more about the specific service that we conduct here at DCI. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at questions@dci.com.
Great. So for today's agenda, we're just going to walk you through the two different types of affirmative action plans that you can essentially structure your workforce around. We'll give you a little bit of regulatory background, jump into a conversation about functional affirmative action plans, or FAPs as they're more commonly known, and then we'll discuss a little bit more about the common establishment-based AAPs, which all of you should be more familiar with. And then also what factors to consider when choosing between the two types of affirmative action plans for your specific workforce. All right, so our first is determining how to, again, structure your affirmative action plans. We're going to talk about functional AAPs first, and specifically based around functions or specific business units that make up your organization. So there are directives, FAP directives out, and so the newest became effective April 28th, 2016, which really govern kind of determining what you can do in terms of developing your functional affirmative action plan. So federal contractors are allowed to enter into agreements with the OFCCP that permits the development of your affirmative action plan to be organized around business functions or lines of business. For some multi-establishment contractors, where you have large businesses or functional units, including a sales division or research and development, marketing divisions that are very large, that may span across many establishments and be located in different states or regions, an affirmative action plan developed by these functional or business units might be most appropriate for your organization. So these FAPs allow contractors to examine whether your personnel practices and affirmative action efforts are sufficient to ensure equal employment opportunity for applicants and employees of a specific functional or business unit rather than by a particular establishment. And again, we're going to get into a little bit more about the directive that became effective in April of 2016 and talk about some of the differences between that directive and what previous guidance had stated. All right, so how do we define a function or business unit? So these units are generally not defined by physical location, but rather they're referring to components within an organization that do operate autonomously in the ordinary course of the organization's business. So again, they may span several different establishments or geographic areas, but refer specifically to things like a sales workforce or marketing department, research and development. Functional or business units should have identifiable personnel practices or transactional activities that are specific to those units. This includes things like applicant flow data, hires, promotions, terminations data, and also compensation determinations that are distinguishable from other parts of the organization's business. Functions or business units are defined and identified based on the organization's existing business operations, personnel practices, or management structures. So again, your organization should already have this structure in place. It's not something that you design solely for the use of affirmative action plans. And again, FAPs do require an approval process, so this isn't something you can just decide you meet the criteria and, oh, I want to have a functional affirmative action plan. You do actually have to go through an approval process in which the OFCCP approves that your organization is structured in a way that's consistent with having a functional affirmative action plan. So what are those criteria? So to be considered for a functional affirmative action plan, a contractor must meet several basic requirements. So your functional or business units must exist and operate independently. And they must include at least 50 employees and have their own managing official, and also the ability to track and maintain your own personnel activity, as we mentioned on the previous slide. So things to consider here when you're determining what structure is most appropriate for your affirmative action plan. You want to think about, does my organization have autonomous function or business units? If not, then the structure may not be appropriate for you. Again, you have to meet those 4 prongs to even consider this. And then the second piece really to consider is whether or not this structure would make sense for your affirmative action plan. So when you're running these analyses and you're, kind of doing everything to comply with those affirmative action plan provisions, does a functional affirmative action plan make sense? Will it provide you some meaning in those terms for your organization? And if not, then you would consider the more commonly used establishment-based AAPs. Just some program specifications. So again, in going through the approval process for structuring your organization around a FAP, you would have to submit in writing a request to the OFCCP director explaining why you believe FAPs are the most appropriate structure for your organization. You would describe in detail how the FAPs relate to your organizational structure, and then also include a transition plan describing the process and timing by which your organization would move from the existing establishment-based AAP to the FAP structure. Once OFCCP receives the request, it must be no later than 120 days prior to the expiration of your current AAP, or within 120 days after you're awarded a contract if you're a new contractor. These requests are typically processed by OFCCP within 60 days or less. During this time, the OFCCP is reviewing your application materials, performing some background research, and they may request a meeting with company officials to discuss the application and your company profile. So until the agreement is actually approved by the OFCCP, you must continue to develop, implement, and maintain AAPs at the establishment level. As far as modifying or updating your approved AAP, contractors have to report at least annually any changes to your agreement. This is things like changes to the names of the functional units, changes to managing officials, contract information, or updated federal contract information specifically. If you're adding new functional units or removing existing functional units, the OFCCP will need to modify your contract accordingly. So if you fail to submit this annual update, the OFCCP may schedule you for a compliance evaluation. So it's really important to, again, make those annual updates as required. And then again, if there's any significant changes to your corporate structure, things like a merger, acquisition, downsizing, or a major reorganization, then the contractors should provide a written explanation of these changes that occurred within 60 calendar days of the effective date of the changes. As far as certifying, you are required to certify in writing every 3 years, basically just stating that you want to continue to operate under a functional affirmative action plan structure. And these agreements will be certified and reissued for another 3-year term after the execution of the agreement by the contractor's representative and the OFCCP director. So again, you're certifying these every year to say my company still operates in such a way that's compliant with the requirements of developing a functional affirmative action agreement. As far as terminating a FAP, if you wish to terminate your agreement, you have to give 90 days calendar notice to the OFCCP with a brief explanation as to why you want to terminate and what the effective date will be. And then once that FAP agreement has been terminated, all employees are required to cover their establishments or to develop establishment-based affirmative action plans within 120 days of that termination of the FAP. And finally, as we mentioned previously, there was a new directive that took effect April 28, 2016, in which a few minor provisions were made in comparison to the directive that had been in place prior to that. So I just wanted to mention these and highlight them on this slide. Again, they're very minor, but the main 4 updates included contract information that's being provided. So the prior directive required that contractors submit a copy of a qualifying federal contract with their application. This requirement changed, and contractors are now only required to provide contact information for at least one federal contract. As far as the time frame for submitting modification requests, prior directive required that significant changes, such as mergers or acquisitions, be reported within 60 days of the change, but this was updated to the information is now required at least 60 days prior to the implementation for the change. So it must again happen outside of that 60-day window versus within the 60-day window. Third, OFCCP removed a provision that contractors undergo at least 2 compliance evaluations during the 3-year term of the agreement. Contractors are now required only to undergo at least 1 compliance evaluation during that term. And finally, to ensure that the OFCCP has complete information on each of the facilities that's covered within each of the functional units, the revised directive requires that contractors provide detailed information concerning the locations of employees. So prior to the updated directive, they were required only to provide city and state information, whereas now you should be providing company or subsidiary name, street address, total number of employees, and the name and address of specific managing officials at each of those. So overall, functional affirmative action plans are again very detailed, and they are specific to organizations that operate under this structure and have to go through an approval process. They're less common than the establishment-based affirmative action plans that we're going to get into right now, but we did want to mention them since there are specific things to consider. And again, as a contractor, you have the option for structuring your affirmative action plan in what makes the most sense for your specific business need.
All right, so now we're going to be shifting to the establishment-based AAPs. As Brittany mentioned, the establishment-based AAPs are a little bit more common. Most of our clients have establishment-based AAPs, so let's get into that. Again, we're going to provide you with just a little bit of the regulatory background. And so, what does the regulations say? What are you required to follow? So as stated in the Federal Code of Regulations 60-2.1, contractors are to develop and maintain a written affirmative action plan for each establishment that you have. And so the employee is to be included in the workforce in one of the AAPs where they work at, with a couple of exceptions. So the first one is if an employee is working separately from a manager, they must be included in their manager's AAP. The second one is establishments that have 50 employees or less. So you have a couple of options for those that we'll get into a little bit later. And then that final one is for employees whom the selection decisions are made at a higher level. So they would be included in that AAP where the decisions are being made at the higher level AAP. So what is an establishment? Who goes where and how do I determine that? Well, it's a brick and mortar building that is either owned or leased by the federal contractor. And so each physical location that should have its own affirmative action plan. So I mentioned the exceptions earlier is for those that have less than 50 employees. And so there are a couple of things to think through when making a decision on whether you're going to have an establishment-based AAP. So the first thing is, how many locations do I have? Are they large? Are they small? As Brittany mentioned, you want to make sure that you have meaningful analysis that you can get from your affirmative action plans that are being developed. And so one thing to think through is if you have a lot of locations, but they are under that 50 mark or threshold, then how else would you develop those? And we'll get into those a little bit later as well. So the first exception is, so you have your establishments that are 50 and over. So the regulations state that you are to develop an affirmative action plan for each location, and each employee is to be in that affirmative action plan that they work at. Again, it's just sort of repeating the information that is outlined, and now we're going to get into the exceptions. So the first one is for the locations that employee, so if you have an AAP and you have employees at that location, but their manager is sitting at a different AAP. And so, for example, you can have an employee that works in a DC location, however, their manager actually sits at Virginia. So you would pull that employee into the Virginia AAP. The second exception that you are to consider when developing an establishment-based AAP is for employers, actual locations where you have less than 50 employees. And so you have a couple of options for that one. The first one is you can decide to develop an AAP for that particular establishment. The second one is developing an AAP which covers the location of the personal function which supports that establishment. And last but not least, you have an option of developing an AAP which covers the location of the individual to whom they report to. And so again, there's a couple of things that you want to think through to consider here. So the first one would be the scope of an audit. So the agency may take an interest in auditing more than that particular location if they see trends, or if they see a particular flag. So you want to consider that. The second one is, as we previously mentioned in the presentation here, is to have meaningful analytics. So having a clear understanding of the structure and to think through the components that are part of the factor availability setup. So we're thinking through the recruitment areas, feeder groups, what those weights are going to look like, and then understanding the results of that affirmative action plan. And then last but not least, you also want to think through the communication of the results of that affirmative action plan and the results. How are you going to cascade this information to those particular leaders in those locations or those AAPs? The last exception that you have to the establishment-based AAPs is for employees for whom the selection decisions are made at a higher level establishment within the organization. They must be in that higher level establishment AAP. So if you have individuals that are in a particular location, but their decisions regarding that is taking place at corporate, those individuals should be bucketed to that corporate AAP establishment. A couple of things to consider when developing an establishment-based AAP or a FAP are organizational characteristics. So again, as I mentioned, what do those physical locations look like? How many do we have? If you're a smaller contractor with just a couple of locations, you probably don't need to apply for a FAP AAP because you're probably not functioning autonomously under those units, whether it be sales, marketing, or what have you. Another thing to think through is just the size. And then last but not least, that structure. So what do those divisional boundaries look like? Again, how many units? And then one important thing to consider is the alignment with affirmative action plans and FABs is the EEO1 and the VETS reporting. So during the course of a compliance evaluation, the OFCCP will request copies of your EEO1 reports and your VETS reporting. And these reports don't have to necessarily map your affirmative action plan. However, you'll need to be able to articulate and explain what those differences are. So keeping in mind that when you're developing your AAP structure, keeping in mind how you'll also have your EEO1 and your VETS reporting set up. And then again, there's different audit selection processes that are related to when you are either under an establishment-based AAP and a VET. So if you're an establishment-based AAP, your EEO1 reports come into play. They're one of the factors that are being considered when being selected for an audit through the neutral selection process system. And with the VETs, also that doesn't come into play. I think it's just the EEO1s. But again, keeping in mind that these are things to think through as you are selecting which type of structure you'll have.
And just to recap, so you do, as a contractor, have options, again, when establishing your affirmative action plan structure. So you can apply for functional AAPs, again, if your business is structured on those units or those functions, and that makes sense for your organization, and you're going to gather more meaningful analyses in structuring your affirmative action plans that way. It's a great option to kind of move through that. Again, it's less common for contractors to develop functional affirmative action plans, and more common for establishment-based AAPs. But again, when you also develop the establishment-based AAPs, you also have options there as far as, again, dealing with employees at smaller locations and in different situations like that. So in structuring your affirmative action plans, you really just kind of want to take a step back and look at your organization, consider the structure. I know that you do have choices, and that's why DCI is here as well, as you're kind of working through your different options and what might make sense for your organization. Reaching out to your consultant, discussing some of these issues or concerns will definitely help you in, reaching what your best option might be, and in turn, applying for a FAP or designing your establishment-based AAPs will be a lot easier process. If you have any questions at the end of this webinar, please feel free to email DCI at questions@dciconsult.com. We are definitely here to answer all of the questions that you may have and work with you further in the future. So thank you so much for attending today. We really appreciate it.